Good morning, everybody. As you know, we're here today to tell you about the Senate budget targets and a budget we think that reflects what Minnesota's priorities are. We think it ensures the state's budget stability going forward into the next biennium. And you'll notice when you look at the targets, we're spending almost half of the money we're spending on education, on K-12 and higher ed. We think that is a critical priority for us. When you look in the tax area, all of that target that you see is not tax relief. Some of it is tax relief, including property tax. And some of it is restoring some of the accounting measures that were used in the 80s so that make sure going forward that those kind of mechanisms are available to future legislatures. It's going to spend less than the governor, it's going to cut taxes less than the House, and it's going to put $250 million into the budget reserve. It was the Senate last year that in the early tax bill insisted we put additional money into the budget reserve. We think that is very, very important. And on the budget surplus, I just want to say, remember the current biennium we're in, and the budget surplus we have today is made possible by the governor and the Democratic legislature that was in place the last 2 years. And the budget surplus specifically, when we adjourned last year and went home, we left $600 million unspent, carried forward into this biennium. And now people call it a surplus, but what it was a restraint in spending that has led to the good economic times and the revenue that we now have available to invest in the priorities that we all share. So we're going to have that same kind of budget restraint going into this session in our negotiations with the governor and the House, so that we ensure that the next group of leaders that are here 2 years from now are in the same kind of position we're in today, with a state with a sound structural budget that ensures stability for all of our state agencies and all the programming that the state provides.
I want to comment for a couple of minutes. You know, I love history stories. I know we have a number of new folks in the Capitol Press Corps. I want to comment for a couple of minutes on the budget reserve number. And some of you will recall, and Tom made the reference, Senator Skoye and I had legislation 2 years ago to put monies automatically after the November forecast into the budget reserve. I want to take it back just a few years before that. You might recall that we had the Long Range Budget Trends Commission, and that was legislation authored by Representative Van Lancheski and myself. We weren't on the commission. It was co-chaired by former Republican Representative and Plenty Commissioner Kevin Goodnow and former Perpich Finance Commissioner Jay Kudrowski. And one of their strongest recommendations was that the budget reserve ought to be at 5% of general fund dollars, and that was important for budget stability. It was important for economic stability, important for the credit rating of the state. And if you read carefully what the Council of Economic Advisors puts together, or what they recommend in the promulgation of the state budget forecast, and if you go through the entirety of the document presented by the management budget, you will find that over the last several years, this is whether it's the Dayton administration, MMB, or the Plenty MMB office, there was always a strong recommendation that we build toward that 5% budget reserve. With this budget, we're not there yet, but this takes us to approximately $1.6 billion versus that optimum $2 billion number. And I would guess that if you look at states around the country, you'll find that we are close to it in terms of building up a budget reserve that every national credit rating looks for, that anybody who any economist, whether conservative or liberal politically, looks to relative to budget stability. So we think that's an important component, and it follows what the Senate Democrats started to do 2 years ago with not just the three of us, but with the entirety of our caucus. And I just wanted to offer some history on that and a reference relative to why we thought it was important to include more money to the budget reserve. Keep in mind that with November forecast, some of that was automatically put into the forecast into the reserve through the forecast. In this case, we do it on our own.
I would like to take a little look back at where we are today in comparison to where we were. And really, when you look at the state's economy and the unemployment rates, we're about back to where we were under the Ventura administration. I think that it's important for us to kind of look and see what was done within spending and tax areas then, and make sure that we are not repeating mistakes that were made. And so when we are looking at the tax budget for this year, if there truly are one-time monies, we should use them for one-time expenses. Some of these accounting maneuvers that we will be proposing are one-time expenditures, and therefore they're probably more appropriate than some of the ongoing tax changes that could be problematic into the future. But with that, we're looking forward to moving forward with that modest proposal that will include property tax relief as well as some of the repayments.
It certainly is not an easy process, but I think that the Senate has landed here with targets that we are relatively comfortable with. There is some concern that our E12 target isn't as high as some of the education advocates are calling for, or that some of us believe is right, but I'm hopeful that throughout the end of the legislative process that target in particular will continue to improve and be a little bit better. But overall, again, I think that the Senate is headed in a very good direction, and we're certainly on a path of fiscal sustainability so that the state can look forward to budget times where we're not on a roller coaster as has been in the past. This is a fiscally sustainable budget that will treat us all well in the future.
You know, I shouldn't speak for Senator Skoye, but I think you can kind of assume that about half of that tax target is likely to be repaying some accounting measures that were done in the past, which puts our tax relief number kind of pretty similar to where the governor's at, actually. You know, we just think that's very, very important, and the Senate has a strong role to play in these negotiations. Some of you have heard me say there are only 39 of us in the legislature, in the entire legislature, that were here during the 90s when we cut taxes year after year after year, that then were here in the 2000s when we managed deficits for more than a decade. So I think the challenge for those of us that have been around, especially for Senator Cohen in the Finance Committee and Senator Skoye in the Tax Committee, is to make sure we don't repeat some of the mistakes that were made and put the state's financial stability at risk going forward. Everyone would like to spend more money. Everybody would like to have a tax cut. But really, the state budget is critically important to the delivery of all the services that our state and local governments provide, and making sure that that stability is there going forward is just really, really critical. So I think, you know, we're not in a position where the Senate's going to propose, we're going to sit down with the House and kind of trade nickels back and forth based off of their targets. That's not what we're going to do. We're laying out a proposal here that says this is a budget that they should consider enacting into law. This is a good final product. Now, to get them there, I think there's just a pretty significant educational process that's going to happen, because they just weren't here. They didn't live through the times, and they don't understand. And I'm not speaking just to Republicans. There are a lot of Democrats and Republicans both that haven't lived through the risks that are posed with a surplus, because the appetites get pretty strong on the part of people with all kinds of things that are important. And not to say that things aren't important, but you have to be careful that you don't overcommit. We've got a pretty strong economy right now in Minnesota, and it won't hold indefinitely. I would argue that we're probably closer to the next recession than we are away from the last one. And building up our budget reserves and having some discipline on spending is going to be very, very important, that we're able to bridge that next economic downturn, which is certain to come. Now, the Senate has a very strong chair process, and Senator Bonoff in higher ed and Senator Uyghur in K-12 with their committee members are going to make those decisions. But I will say, you know, it's a big number. It's almost half of what we're spending. We're spending on education. So It's a very, very strong priority to us, especially when you look at the higher ed number. I mean, when you look at the higher ed number, if you had figured just normal inflation in higher ed, we're over $100 million more in spending than what normal inflation would have been in the higher ed budget. We're very, very close in K-12, slightly less, a few million, of what, if we had just put inflation into K-12 going into the next biennium, we'd have been very close to the number we're at today. But we're making a huge commitment in higher ed, way over inflationary spending. And I expect that Senator Bonoff is going to take very seriously the governor's proposal on putting some additional money into the University of Minnesota Medical School. And I know Senator Stump has been working very, very closely with her in the MnSCU system to look at a different way to deliver vocational and technical education. So we're making huge commitments in the education area of the state's budget. I don't think it's sustainable going down the road to think that MnSCU and the University of Minnesota can come here every 2 years and put their hand up and say, if you give us X, we'll freeze tuition. That kind of spending is not sustainable with an economy with about 2 to 3% GDP growth. So for us to, and we did a very good job the last 2 years in restraining the growth in tuition by actually essentially buying a freeze. I do hope that, and I had dinner with the Chancellor this week, we talked about this. Maybe we can't get a 2-year freeze, but maybe we can get a 1-year freeze. I've talked to the president of the university about, well, maybe we can't freeze tuition for everybody, but maybe we can do it maybe for the undergraduate students. I think there's a hybrid proposal here where we're still going to be able to provide some significant relief on what have otherwise been and has been kind of runaway tuition. Governors don't quite get to ask the probing questions that the legislature does when they get all of the departments in front of the legislature at the committee table, and I just think it's an opportunity the legislature can kind of probe for questions and probe for answers a little more than a governor's capable of achieving. So I'm looking forward to those conversations, both with MnSCU and the U of M and the higher ed budget. It's very, very important to us that we hold down any tuition increases. There may be potentially a partial freeze, some kind of a tuition cap at MnSCU that Senator Bonoff proposes. They've left over $300 million right now in their budget targets unspent. We don't know where that's going to go. And until they kind of firmed those numbers up, it's very hard for us to start any kind of process of negotiating any individual bills. But I can tell you this, the Senate's not going to do Jesse-type checks coming out of this session. That's just not going to happen. Those 39 of us that were here in those days, and emails I've got from a whole lot of Minnesotans, and I got an email last night from a guy that said, I'm a Republican. He said, but don't send me $350. I think most Minnesotans understand that it's better to invest that money in our public infrastructure, in our educational systems when we have some resources, or in our budget reserve when we have some resources around. So we don't know what a $1.1 billion cut looks like. We're not prepared to start negotiating with them on that until we see what programming is impacted by that. But I will tell you this, if their proposal is to dismantle Minnesota Care, a healthcare program in Minnesota that's been very successful, that provides insurance for working poor Minnesotans that pay a premium, the Senate will not dismantle Minnesota Care as a program. And if that is where they find the majority of their savings, we're going to have a bumpy road. And the disappointing thing, if that's their path, is much of that working poor population is in rural towns. A lot of it is small self-employed businesses who don't have an employer to provide health insurance for them. So, the Senate in 2005, we went to a government shutdown over Minnesota Care with Governor Plenty and a Republican House. And I'm not suggesting we're going to do that, but I just think the sentiment in the Senate hasn't changed, and Representative Dean and his committee members need to understand that the Senate feels very strongly that Minnesota Care has been a very good program that served our state well. And I've talked to the Speaker about this. I talked to him this week. I indicated to him that I really thought if we were going to have a good, timely conclusion to the session, we needed to have everything in conference by the 1st of May. So the Senate will start moving budget bills to the floor that week of the 17th of April, and our anticipation will be everything will be off the floor, ready to go to conference before the end of April. And I think that is very, very important. I've expressed that to the Speaker. We've got some significant differences in some of these areas, and it's going to take some significant time for the conferees to figure that out. You know, we do, I don't know if the lease has been executed yet, but I believe all the negotiations are done to relocate the Senate down Cedar Avenue in downtown St. Paul. It's going to be an incredible move after session adjourns, because admin wants us out of the Capitol by the 1st of June if we can make it. And I expressed to the Commissioner of Admin yesterday that they need to start getting ready for that. I mean, the Senate has been officed in the Capitol for 110 years, and we have a lot of things to move out before we can totally turn it over to the contractors. Some of it's going to go into storage that ultimately ends up in the new building. Some of it's going to go to recycling or salvage. Some of it's going to go down to our temporary locations. I will say this on the temporary locations: we are not going to spend money building offices for senators. We are really going to only establish workstations for the legislative offices. So there's a place for the phone to ring, a place for the mail to be dealt with, and there'll be a small number of offices that members will be able to reserve if they have meetings that they feel like they need to have in a legislative space. On the chamber issue, I had conversations with the Speaker this week about that, and with the Department of Administration yesterday. Looking for what the least cost alternative is and what is the best alternative for the renovations of the Capitol to go as timely as possible. When the original Senate building was contemplated, the original design provided for temporary chambers for both the House and the Senate in the new building. I have offered that to the Speaker. I think it can be done at very low cost. The large auditorium room that's in the new Senate building that'll be available to the entire Capitol complex is not being built for the Senate. No place on the Capitol complex is there a large auditorium to hold large type events. The Senate building will have a room like that. It's about the size of the House chamber, maybe even a little bigger. So there is room to temporarily locate the House chamber in there, and I think at very minimal cost. So I actually asked admin yesterday to tell me how much money could we save and how could we improve the schedule of the Capitol renovations if the House were to leave the Capitol, because that decision hasn't been made yet. But we know there'll be no bathrooms in the Capitol. We know that that's going to be very, very difficult for them to operate the House chamber. Very, very expensive to put up the scaffolding, start renovating the chamber, then have the House come back for session and tear it all down, only to have a session and then come back and put it all back up. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of extra dollars. I know the House has looked at some space downtown potentially to build a temporary chamber. Very expensive alternative. There's no broadcast television. I don't have a clue how they would get members from the state office building to a location off the Capitol campus. So I just very strongly have encouraged the Speaker to take a look at using the new auditorium building in the new building. I think it's the lowest cost alternative. It'll make for the smoothest session. I mean, if they move off campus, I don't have a clue how we're going to pass messages back and forth between the House and the Senate, how the conference committees will work. The conference committees are going to have to be in the new Senate building because the Senate rules say that members have to vote for themselves. So those conference committees are going to have to meet in close proximity to our chamber. The House doesn't have a rule like that. They don't necessarily have to be close to their chamber, but just the mechanics of running a session have brought me to conclude that the best place for the House to consider is in the new Senate building. And that's why when the building was originally designed, that was one of the things that was considered, considering where the Capitol renovations are and how important they are. The Speaker and I would like to have a very abbreviated agenda. We've talked about that. The one risk for us, I think, in coming in really late, and I think we'd like to come in really late, likely after the February forecast. The one risk of that is what happens if we get a hiccup in our economy and in November we show a significant budget deficit. Possible, and the February number could be even worse, and it may require quite a bit of committee time to try and figure out how we balance the state budget. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. I hope to have a very abbreviated session, but just a little early for the speaker and I to get our arms around that. But I do expect it's likely to be after the February forecast. What I asked Senator Stump to consider is, bonding bills are hard to put together because every member wants to get a project in. So they generally inch upward. What I asked him to consider were some areas of spending in the area of public infrastructure that maybe couldn't be associated with a member. There are things like HEPRA at the University of Minnesota in Minskew that the number always gets squeezed down to make room for more members' projects. So I've asked them to consider some things like HEPRA at Minskew and at U of M, to consider some money for the Public Facilities Authority for wastewater infrastructure, another area that's always been underfunded, because to make room for members' projects. I think we could take a lot of pressure off next year's bill if we could do some broad categories. Maybe something on housing, certainly the capital. So Senator Stump is going to put a shoulder to the wheel and get something ready, but unless the House sends us something to work with, we're not going to be able to accomplish that. Senator Cohen spent a lot of time with the 7 division chairs, asking them for what their priorities were, and I then sat down with Senators Cohen, and we pared them down to what we thought was something we could accomplish, reflected the priorities, and then still put money in the budget reserve. You can't expect the division chairs who are there to spend money to put money into the reserve. That really is the job of the 4 elected leaders of the Senate as we establish the priorities. All of their asks were higher than what we gave them in all the spending divisions. There's a lot of pressure from all of the advocacy groups to spend money. So we pared back all the spending areas so that we were able to have room to put some money into the budget. I think we're spending almost half of the money on education, on K-12 and higher ed. That is our priority. And then we're going to put some additional money in the budget reserve. We're going to save some money when we have a surplus. And we're going to provide some tax relief in the tax bill.